When the German war machine rode across Europe in 1939 and 1940, it seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, crushed Poland in weeks, overran France in a matter of days, and pushed Britain to the very edge of defeat. To the outside world, Hitler's army looked invincible, and his generals appeared to be masterminds behind a new kind of warfare. But deep inside the ranks of Germany's high command, beneath the crisp uniforms and polished medals, something else was stirring a quiet dread, an unspoken realization that the machine they'd built might already be doomed. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where a general stood up and declared the war lost. It was slower, more suffocating, like watching a great engine overheat while everyone around pretends the smoke isn't real. The first cracks appeared long before the war turned against Germany. Some of Hitler's most trusted commanders, men like Erwin Rommel, Gerd von Rundstedt, and Heinz Guderian, began to see what Hitler refused to see, that the brilliance of Blitzkrieg was not endless, that the empire built on speed, fear, and ideology could not last forever. In those early days, when victory seemed certain, the generals played their roles. They were national heroes, celebrated in newspapers, paraded before cheering crowds, and rewarded with power. But behind closed doors, they saw how decisions were being made impulsively, arrogantly, without logic or military sense. Hitler was no longer just the Führer. He had become a self-proclaimed military genius, convinced that destiny itself guided his every command. His generals, trained in strategy and discipline, were forced to watch as a man with no military background began dictating every move of the largest army in the world. The signs of disaster were there from the beginning. When Hitler ignored the advice of his staff and ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, many of his generals were uneasy. They remembered Napoleon's fate. They knew what the Russian winter could do. But Hitler brushed it all aside. He was convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse like France in weeks. And so, in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, the largest invasion in human history. At first, it looked like another triumph. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured, cities fell, and the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Russia. But as the months dragged on, the tide began to shift. Supplies thinned, the weather turned, the Soviet resistance stiffened. And as German soldiers froze and starved, Hitler refused to retreat. He forbade withdrawals. He ordered his armies to stand and die where they stood, calling it heroic defiance. His generals saw something terrifying in that order, not courage, but madness. By late 1941, some of Hitler's inner circle realized something few dared to speak aloud. Germany could not win a long war. Its resources were stretched too thin. Its factories couldn't keep pace with the demands of the front. Britain was holding out. The United States was preparing for war. And the Soviet Union was still standing. But Hitler didn't want to hear it. Every report that didn't match his fantasies was dismissed as cowardice or sabotage. One of the first to sense the scale of the coming disaster was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. A veteran of World War I, he understood the importance of logistics and planning. When his men faced brutal resistance in the Soviet Union, Rundstedt warned that Germany had underestimated its enemy. He told Hitler that the front was overstretched, that winter would cripple them, and that they should consolidate their gains. Hitler's response was icy. He accused Rundstedt of defeatism. The field marshal was dismissed. Others learned to keep their thoughts to themselves. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, fought in North Africa with brilliance and discipline. His victories made him a legend, but he also saw the limits of Germany's war machine. He watched as his troops ran out of fuel, as supplies failed to arrive, as the Luftwaffe couldn't protect them from the growing Allied air power. He realized that Germany could not fight on so many fronts for long. In private letters to his wife, Rommel confessed his despair not just at the military situation, but at the man giving the orders. He wrote that Hitler was living in a fantasy world, unable to face the truth. Still, no one dared to openly defy him. The German military tradition demanded loyalty, and Hitler used that loyalty like a weapon. He surrounded himself with those who flattered him, punishing anyone who questioned his judgment. Generals who voiced concern were sidelined or dismissed. Those who obeyed blindly were promoted. The high command became a stage where fear disguised itself as respect. And yet, among themselves, the generals talked. Not loudly, not publicly, but in whispers. In dimly lit rooms, they admitted what none of them could say out loud, that the war could not be won. Some, like Colonel General Ludwig Beck, had sensed this even before the invasion of Poland. Beck had warned that Germany was heading toward a catastrophe, that Hitler's aggression would unite the world against them. He was dismissed in 1938, long before the first tank crossed the border. Others saw it later at Stalingrad, in the deserts of Africa, in the frozen forests outside Moscow. Each defeat confirmed what they already knew. Germany's enemies were too many, its leader too reckless, its cause too doomed. But what made it worse, what turned realization into despair, was that none of them could stop it. They were trapped inside the machine they'd helped build. Some had believed in Hitler's vision at first, thinking he could restore Germany's honor after the humiliation of World War I. They thought he would rebuild, not destroy. But by the time they saw the truth, it was too late. They had given him everything, their loyalty, their armies, their silence. As 1942 began, the illusion of victory was fading. The war had turned into a grinding nightmare of attrition. Cities burned, millions died, and the German lines stretched thinner with every passing month. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler grew more isolated. He no longer trusted his generals, preferring the reports of loyal aides who told him what he wanted to hear. He believed Germany was destined to rule, that defeat was impossible, that anyone who doubted him was a traitor. But his generals knew better. They saw the maps, the casualty lists, the desperate faces of soldiers returning from the front. They knew the truth long before Hitler did, that the war was lost, even as the propaganda still promised victory. And yet, they kept fighting, out of duty, out of fear, out of hope that somehow something might change. But deep down, they understood that Germany's fate had already been sealed, not on the battlefield, but in the mind of the man who refused to see reason. It was a realization that came to them in different ways. For some, it came quietly, staring at the endless names of the dead. For others, it struck like a blow, a single, undeniable moment when they understood that every victory from now on was meaningless. In that silence, in those long nights spent studying maps under dim lights, many of Hitler's generals realized they were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival and for a leader who had already doomed them all. But this was only the beginning. The turning point still lay ahead in the deserts of North Africa, in the skies over Berlin, and on the frozen streets of Stalingrad. It was there, in the blood and the ruin, that the truth became impossible to ignore. And as the war dragged on, one by one, the men who had once commanded Hitler's mighty armies would come to see just how deep the delusion ran, and how powerless they truly were to stop the collapse that was already underway. By the time the first German troops froze outside Stalingrad in the winter of 1942, many of Hitler's top commanders no longer believed in victory. They still fought, still commanded, still obeyed the man in the wolf's lair, but in their hearts, they knew. The arrogance of the early years had vanished. What filled its place was something heavier, a realization that they were now participants in a disaster spiraling far beyond their control. In the summer of 1942, Hitler's obsession turned toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. He was convinced that victory there would secure the Reich for 1,000 years. His generals warned him otherwise. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, tasked with invasion, argued that the army didn't have the strength for two major offensives, Stalingrad and the Caucasus, at once. Hitler exploded in anger, accused him of cowardice, and dismissed him on the spot. It became a pattern. Every time a general spoke the truth, he was silenced. Every time the reality of defeat crept closer, Hitler denied it, insisting that faith would win the war. By then, faith was all he had left. Strategy had been replaced by delusion, and reason by rage. As the Battle of Stalingrad dragged on, the Wehrmacht's confidence crumbled. The city became a graveyard. Over 300,000 German soldiers were trapped in the freezing ruins, surrounded by Soviet forces. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, once hailed as one of Germany's most brilliant tacticians, begged Hitler to let him retreat. Hitler's reply was chilling. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold its ground to the last man. Paulus obeyed. He had no choice. He knew the war was lost. He wrote as much in his final reports, but he lacked the courage to defy the Führer. When his starving men finally surrendered in February 1943, it was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler was enraged, calling Paulus a traitor, but among the generals, the truth was undeniable. If even the Sixth Army could be sacrificed so carelessly, there was no strategy left. Only destruction. Across Europe, the same realization was spreading. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Corps was falling apart. British and American forces were pushing him back across the desert. His men were starving, his tanks empty, his supplies cut off. He had once been Hitler's shining star, the perfect soldier, respected even by his enemies. But now, Rommel saw what had become of his army, exhausted, broken, and abandoned. When Rommel requested to withdraw from Africa, Hitler refused. He called retreat dishonorable. Rommel ignored the order, saving thousands of men by disobeying a direct command. It was a quiet act of rebellion, but a dangerous one. He knew Hitler never forgot disobedience. Letters between Rommel and his wife from this time reveal his despair. The Führer, he wrote, has lost all contact with reality. By 1943, the generals understood they were fighting not for Germany's survival but for Hitler's pride. The man who once preached discipline now governed through hysteria. He'd scream at his commanders during briefings, pounding the table with trembling fists, calling them traitors if they dared to question him. Even his closest allies began to doubt him. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant mind behind Blitzkrieg, tried to convince Hitler that the Eastern Front was collapsing. He argued for defensive fortifications, for pulling back to more manageable lines. Hitler cut him off. "The German army does not retreat," he shouted. Guderian left the meeting convinced that Germany's defeat was now only a matter of time. In private, many generals spoke of what they called the inevitable end. They knew the Allies were growing stronger every day. The factories in America were producing more tanks, planes, and ammunition than all of Europe combined. The Royal Air Force had taken back control of the skies. The Red Army was rolling westward with terrifying momentum. And still, Hitler raged against reality. He blamed everyone but himself, the weather, the generals, even his own soldiers. He ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, convinced it would stop any Allied invasion. He talked endlessly of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, new jets, new rockets, new bombs, but these were fantasies. The generals knew it. They had seen the numbers, the production figures, the exhausted faces of the men coming home from the front. Some of them began to whisper about doing the unthinkable, removing Hitler himself. It wasn't a decision born of politics, but of desperation. Men like Ludwig Beck, Henning von Treschow, and Klaus von Stauffenberg believed that only by killing Hitler could Germany save itself from total ruin. Their discussions were cautious, quiet, always hidden. Even a hint of betrayal could mean death. But not all shared their courage. Many generals were trapped by their own fear, by the oath they had sworn not to Germany, but to Hitler personally. It was an oath of absolute loyalty, a promise that bound their honor to his madness. Breaking it meant betrayal. Keeping it meant complicity. Most chose silence. When Italy surrendered in 1943, Hitler's fury erupted. He screamed that his allies were cowards, that the world was conspiring against him. But behind his back, even his own men were now calling him what he had become, a dictator who no longer understood war. The tide of defeat grew heavier with each passing month. Allied bombers began to flatten German cities. The once proud Luftwaffe was now fighting a losing battle in the skies. The Eastern Front collapsed under the Soviet advance. For the generals, every map they studied told the same story. The Reich was shrinking. In the field headquarters, conversations grew darker. Some generals openly wept over reports of entire divisions wiped out. Others turned to fatalism. If Germany was to fall, they said it would fall fighting. But deep down, most knew they weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were just delaying the inevitable. Still, Hitler demanded the impossible. He ordered fortress cities to hold out to the last man places like Warsaw, Budapest, and Königsberg. Civilians were trapped, soldiers slaughtered, all to preserve the illusion of control. When a general dared to suggest surrender, he was executed or sent to the front as punishment. It was during these final years that the contrast between the generals' public faces and private thoughts became unbearable. They still wore their uniforms, still saluted, still obeyed, but inside, they were broken men. Many turned to alcohol, some to despair, and a few to quiet defiance. In 1944, as the Allies landed in Normandy, the situation reached its breaking point. The Atlantic wall that Hitler had promised would never fall crumbled within days. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending France, pleaded with Hitler to end the war, to negotiate before Germany was destroyed. Hitler refused. He ordered counterattacks that made no sense, wasting men and machines on hopeless assaults. That summer, a bomb was placed in the meeting room at the Wolf's Lair, part of a desperate attempt to end the madness. It failed. Hitler survived, and the revenge that followed was merciless. Thousands were arrested. Many of the men who had once fought loyally for him were executed. Rommel himself was given a grim choice: public trial and humiliation, or suicide. He chose the latter. His death marked more than the loss of a general. It symbolized the end of the illusion that loyalty could save them. Even those who had once believed in Hitler now saw him clearly for what he was: a man consumed by his own delusions, dragging a nation into the abyss. As 1945 approached, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. Cities lay in ruins. The people were starving. The generals no longer planned for victory, they planned for survival. Some tried to surrender their units quietly to the Allies. Others simply gave up. But inside Hitler's bunker in Berlin, the fantasy still lived. He spoke of phantom divisions that didn't exist, of counterattacks that would never come. His generals listened in silence, knowing full well that the war was already over and that the man giving the orders no longer lived in reality. Still, they obeyed. Because in Nazi Germany, obedience had long replaced reason, and for many of those generals, the only thing left to lose was their lives. In the final months of the war, the map of Europe no longer looked like the empire Hitler had promised. What had once been a vast territory stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga was now a fractured shell, burning cities, collapsing front lines, and broken armies stumbling westward through snow and mud. The German generals, once confident, now moved like ghosts through dimly lit headquarters, issuing orders they no longer believed in. By early 1945, every conversation among them carried the same unspoken truth: it was over. The Soviet armies were closing in from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Berlin was already within artillery range. But inside the Führer bunker, Hitler refused to face reality. He sat hunched over maps that no longer reflected the world outside, moving imaginary divisions across non-existent front lines, ordering counterattacks from armies that had long ceased to exist. His generals stood around the table, silent. They knew these armies were gone, destroyed in the snow, captured, or in full retreat, but no one dared to speak. Every time a general tried to reason with him, Hitler exploded in a fury of denial. "Victory is still possible," he would say. "The miracle weapons will save us." It was delusion at its most complete. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations, once described those meetings as a descent into unreality. He later admitted that by February 1945, most of the high command no longer expected to survive. They knew that defeat was inevitable. The only question was how much destruction would come before the end. In the ruins of Berlin, ordinary soldiers and civilians were trapped in a nightmare. Bombs fell day and night. The once proud capital was now a wasteland of smoke and rubble. Even as Soviet artillery shells exploded nearby, Hitler's orders grew more detached from reality. He commanded units to defend bridges that no longer existed, to launch attacks from streets that were already reduced to ashes. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, another of Hitler's closest military advisors, began to lose his composure. He'd once been a man of iron discipline, known for his loyalty, but now he wept openly during meetings. The generals had gone from soldiers to spectators, watching the total collapse of everything they had built. Some tried to surrender their forces quietly to the Allies in the West, hoping to spare their men from Soviet captivity. Others still clung to their oaths, unwilling to defy the Führer even in the final hours. But all of them knew the Reich was finished. In the first days of April, the Soviets encircled Berlin. Hitler's generals could hear the thunder of artillery echoing through the city. The once mighty Wehrmacht was reduced to teenagers in uniform and elderly men with rifles. Ammunition was running out, food was gone. Yet Hitler continued to speak of imaginary victories. He told his staff that the armies of General Walter Wenck would soon arrive from the west to rescue Berlin. But those forces, barely organized, were already being torn apart by the advancing Allies. General Hans Krebs, the chief of the Army General Staff, realized the truth before anyone else inside the bunker. In his diary, he wrote that Hitler lives in a world of his own creation and that none of us can reach him anymore. The generals had become prisoners of their own silence, men who once commanded millions, now powerless to speak reason to one man. On the 22nd of April 1945, during one of the last military conferences in the bunker, Hitler's delusion finally cracked. When he learned that Berlin's defense had completely collapsed, he erupted in rage, shouting that the generals had betrayed him, that they had sabotaged his orders, that the entire army was filled with traitors. Then, without warning, he broke down. Witnesses later recalled that he slumped into his chair, trembling, muttering that everything was lost. That was the moment, the final, undeniable moment, when even his most loyal officers realized the truth they had long feared. Their leader had destroyed himself, and with him, their country. In the final days, one by one, the generals abandoned hope. Some took their own lives rather than face capture. Others burned their uniforms and tried to flee through the ruins. General Jodl and Field Marshal Keitel remained in the bunker until the end, signing orders for non-existent divisions and pretending, perhaps for their own sanity, that they were still in command of something greater than a dying city. Above ground, Soviet troops closed in. Every hour, the explosions grew louder. Fires raged across the skyline, and the air smelled of smoke and fear. The once mighty Reich had shrunk to a few blocks of shattered stone. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his underground bunker. When the news reached the generals who still held their positions across Germany, reactions were mixed. Some wept. Others felt a grim sense of relief. But for most, it was confirmation of what they had known for years, that the war had been lost long before that bullet was fired. A week later, on May 7, at a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender. He looked pale, defeated, exhausted. As he signed the documents, he said only one thing: "I hope this will be for the benefit of Germany." There was no ceremony, no pride, just silence. The war that had promised to reshape the world ended not with a triumph, but with a whisper of resignation. Many of Hitler's generals would later stand before Allied judges, their medals stripped, their reputations destroyed. Some were executed, others imprisoned. A few tried to rewrite their roles in history, claiming they had only followed orders or that they had secretly opposed the Führer all along. But history remembers the silence, the years when they knew and did nothing. For many, that silence was their greatest burden. Men like Guderian, Rundstedt, and Kesselring spent the rest of their lives haunted by the realization that they had seen the collapse coming and could not or would not stop it. They had been trapped by fear, by loyalty, by pride. And in the end, they learned too late that obedience can be as destructive as betrayal. As the ashes of Berlin settled, the world looked upon the ruins of the Third Reich and asked a single question. How could so many brilliant men have followed one delusional leader into oblivion? The answer lies not only in Hitler's madness, but in their silence, the silence of men who saw the truth and chose to look away. When Hitler's generals realized they had lost, the war was far from over on paper. Battles still raged, soldiers still died, cities still burned. But in their hearts, they had already surrendered not to the Allies, but to the truth. They had watched the tide turn, watched their leader lose his grasp on reality, and known that nothing could stop what was coming. The tragedy of Germany's high command was not that they lost the war, it was that they saw the loss long before it happened, and yet continued down the same path, step by step, into the abyss. History remembers their brilliance, their discipline, their tactics. But beneath all that, it also remembers their fear, the quiet, suffocating fear that kept them silent while their world burned. And in that silence, the war was lost long before the final shot was fired.